And the first class, we talked about some of the cultural background of Poles and Ukrainians. In the second class, we talked about the Jews and how they began to interact with these other groups. And today we'll continue, get into the 20th century today, which I think will be of interest. But first we have to get the program to cooperate. It's not cooperating, but we'll do it this way. There we go. I'd like to review just for a minute some of the names that are really unfamiliar to a lot of people, I'm sure. And this is what we've done in previous classes. We had Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who led a Cossack rebellion in 1648, which sort of set the borders that allowed Ukraine to be part of Russia and not part of the Polish Commonwealth. He's also considered high on the list of devils in Jewish history because of the pogroms that took place in 1648 and afterwards. We mentioned the hetman, meaning the head man, if you will, Mazepa, another Cossack rebel who was allied with the Swedes against Peter the Great, and he was then excommunicated by the Ukrainian church, not brought back in until 1991. And there's an opera by Tchaikovsky, if you're interested in following the image. We mentioned Adam Mickiewicz, Polish national poet, who died in 1855. And we remarked that he's also considered Lithuanian by the Lithuanians, and he's considered White Russian by the White Russians, Belarus. There he is. We had Taras Shevchenko, who is seen as the Ukrainian national poet. On the Jewish side, we had the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht, who's the founder of this movement called Hasidism. He died in 1760. And some of the groups that come after him, the Chabad Hasidism, which are the proselytizers whom you may run into on the street at any time in any country. The Vilna Gaon, who is the chief opponent. And this internal Jewish cultural and linguistic debate between the Galicianers, those who come from Galicia, and the Litvaks who come from Lithuania, meaning the far north, more than just Lithuania now. A lot of these names will reappear. I just wanted to fill out one last thing from the second lecture, that we didn't talk about emigration, and I can't spend a lot of time on it, but I want to point out that from 1881 to 1914, 2.5 million Jews left the Russian Empire, including 2 million to the US. That's a lot of people, plus another 350,000 from Galicia. And if you look at this average emigration, 17.3 people per thousand left Russia. That's a lot of people, 9.6 from Galicia. And so even though there are immigrants from the other groups, the Jews really move out. Here is a painting done at the time, well, in the early 20th century, Moritzy Minkowski, after the pogrom. So the pogroms were not the only reason for the emigration, but they sure contributed to it. As opposed to the Poles, not opposed, but in the 1910 census, about 900,000 people in the United States spoke Polish. That's the best we can do, at least that I could find, for figuring how many Poles lived here. And Ukrainians, I said I have by 1880, 1.2 million immigrants. Well, that's because lots of them went to Russia. But by 1914, you have another 500,000, including very sizable communities, not only in the US, but in Canada, Brazil, and Argentina. So even today in Canada, you have, since the government supports special schools. You go to Manitoba or Saskatchewan, you'll find Ukrainian language public schools. I'm not total Ukrainian, but bilingual schools. Okay, the stuff we want to talk about today. I mentioned Khmelnytsky, the heritage differs depending on who's looking at it. Here, this top picture, early 20th century Cossack fighters. These guys are fierce fighters, and they are, although in the 17th and 18th century, they fought against the Tsar, by the 19th century, they become the enforcers. And I think a lot of you have probably heard the term something wild as a Cossack or something. And in fact, here in the 20 teens, you got Cossacks in the Russian army beating down the crowd. They're still being used by Putin in Russia because of that military tradition. I just mentioned that that's that border that was set within Russia in 1654. The question is, who are these Cossacks? That's not a major part of this course, but they moved down to sparsely populated areas in the 16th and 17th century, and they had a lot of local autonomy. Some people see this as the early process of development of the Ukrainian nation, although not all of them spoke Ukrainian. But they're a military estate, and as I mentioned just now, they still have a military tradition, although depends whom they support. In the 19th century, it was the Tsar. In the 1918, 1921, it was a civil war in which they supported the white armies against the Reds. So the new Soviet government tried to disband them, but eventually they got reformed. There are a number of Russian Cossack groups that were at one time paramilitary formations. Now they have, if those of you are interested in music from Eastern Europe, they have a number of Cossack choral groups. That's also a tradition. Not the Don Cossacks were, when I was younger, were a known choir. When I was in Europe a few years ago, there was another Cossack choir coming through. So it's sort of a mixed kind of thing. It's military, it's choral, and it's social. Then we have the Poles. The Poles have a glorification of the past. Now, this picture on the right, first time I saw this, I couldn't believe it. But these are the guys who they were terrors in this 16th, 17th century. I'm going to show you a short clip from a movie, but it's a recreation of what these guys were like. I'm going to get over here. So the winged hussars, and they were pretty tough guys, and that's a tradition that stood up in Poland. I mean, the rumor was in 1939 that they tried to do the same kind of cavalry charge against the German tanks. Probably an overdone rumor, but that is the tradition, a Polish military tradition that's really considered, important for Polish self-consciousness. It's always hard to get to the next slide. There we go. So we have these Polish self-images of military greatness. In 1683, they went to the defense of Vienna. This is considered the high point of Turkish Ottoman expansion into Europe, and the Poles are given credit for breaking the siege of Vienna. There was the Kosciuszko Rebellion of 1794. Some of you may be familiar with the name.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear it all?
Not much.
Is that any better?
Larry, you're very faint.
Hey, wait.
Maybe you're too far away from your,
I'm about 2 inches from my microphone. Is it any better now?
a little bit, not much. So it suddenly went down.
How about now?
That's good.
That's good. Yeah.
All right. I'm holding the mic really close. I'm glad you told me. Sorry about that. Anyway, we have these Polish self-images of greatness. The relief of the siege of Vienna in 1683. Then Kosciuszko, whose name you may recognize from the American Revolution. And this was a time of the Polish partitions. And this was the last gasp against defeating the Russians before Poland disappeared completely for over a century. Kosciuszko, Poles volunteered with Napoleon, and you have Polish legions who fought in the West. Here's Jan Henryk Dąbrowski, who's the most famous commander of the Polish legions. And if you recall from last week when we sang the Polish national, 2 weeks ago, we sang the Polish national anthem. The chorus starts, "March, March, Dąbrowski." So he's still alive in the national anthem from the 1790s. After the partitions, there was something called the Congress Kingdom of Poland for about 40 years, where there was a kind of autonomy under Russian rule. But with the uprising of 1830-31, that was the beginning the crackdown of the on the Poles. For example, the official language had been Polish, but after 1831, Russia became a co-official language, and autonomy was sort of ended at the time. And then there was another uprising in 1863, and this was really a repressive time where all kinds of cultural institutions were done away with, and a real repression of things Polish. Here's a painting, Polish Partisans of 1863. That is, it's still alive in Polish memory, just as, we in our own history have our memories of, quote, glorious days. 1863 was a military revolt. After that, Poles tried to do something a little more subtle in terms of cultural development, and we'll see in a minute. The Russians attempted to eradicate Polish culture. So here we have an attempt to combat the Russians. And we have a man named Józef Pilsudski. And he's viewed as the father of the Second Polish Republic, which comes about in the 1920s, reestablished in 1918. His concern was a multi-ethnic Poland, which would include all of Lithuania, all of Ukraine. If you remember, here, he's born in the Russian Empire in what is now Lithuania, was exiled in Siberia. In 1893, he joined the Polish Socialist Party, which is called the PPS, although he was not a socialist internationalist. If you recall, the Polish national epic, Pan Tadeusz, starts out, "Lithuania, oh my fatherland," which is very strange when you when you first look at Polish literature is the Polish national epic starts out with the words Lithuania, my fatherland. And this becomes important, you'll see, for Pilsudski's attempt at a Polish foreign policy. He himself had a father who was who fought in 1863, later exiled to Siberia. He himself was imprisoned by the Russians, but escaped to Galicia, which, if you recall, was in Austria-Hungary. Let me see. I just looked at the chats, and I wanted to go back that those winged hussars apparently made a wild sound when they charged the enemy. This is a contribution from Neville. And they played a crucial role in a lot of battles, including the siege of Vienna in 1683. But going back to Pilsudski, his policy from Austria-Hungary was to fight for Polish independence. He was more extreme in that regard than other parties. The other parties were more conciliatory, and they were looking for more Polish autonomy, which they got some of in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Galicia. Pilsudski himself, however, formed a combat organization. And in 1904, in Warsaw, you have really open warfare with the Russian police. And in 1905, again, you may know there was a revolution in Russia in 1905, which included Poland. And some of his groups had clashes with other Poles who were loyal to someone named Roman Dmowski. And I'll say a little bit about more Dmowski in a minute. But Pilsudski, as a leader of this Polish Socialist Party, formed what are called Polish legions, actual military groups to fight against the Russians. But in 1917, he'd had enough of the Germans. He found that they were not supporting what he was interested in, and he was imprisoned by the Germans. Well, of course, after the First World War, he got out and he became chief of state. And we'll mention in a minute a coup d'etat in 1926. But first, World War I. The Eastern Front, Galicia, Silesia, Bielorussia or Belarus, which some people call the Polish lands, is where lots of the battles were fought. Here is this attempt to create a Polish army. And as you see these various uniforms on the left, you have this artillery officer from Pilsudski's army, and then uniforms of some of the others on the right, the rank and file soldiers. And I mentioned once before this novel, Radziecki March. I like to throw in here some references to literature, which may help you. And this talks about that Austro-Hungarian army, which had many nationalities in it at the time. And here's one example. It's not historically well known, but if you look at this picture here, right down here, you see why I show you this. It's a book I translated, and it's about a family on the border between Galicia and Ukraine, a relatively prosperous farming family, Jewish farming family, that got absolutely ruined by the First World War because that's where the armies marched. First, the Russians marched across this Bug River there. Then the Austro-Hungarians pushed back. Then the Russians came again. So the army was overrun. I mean, the farm was overrun at least 5 times during the war. So they were really impoverished at the end of the war. But this is a memoir of one of the families, the Rottenberg family from Galicia and Ukraine. There were during the war, there were promises by everybody in sight to help the Poles. The Tsar said he's going to set up a Poland. The German Kaiser says he wants the Poland. The Austro-Hungarian Emperor wants the Poles. Everybody was promising a free Poland, and there was a certain amount of enthusiasm as the Polish legions fought for Austria, although they were eventually disbanded. Remember when I said 1917, Pilsudski sort of gets disenchanted. He gets thrown in jail, and they disband the armies. In 1915, the Germans broke through in Galicia, and then they captured Warsaw. Warsaw itself becomes a German-occupied city. They take Vilna, and the Poles at first were very excited, and then were, excuse me, quickly disenchanted. Here's an image that says from the Galician war front, and that's the heir to the throne, Karl Franz Josef, there visiting the front. And if you remember, lots of these European rulers felt that they were also great military strategists. They were not, but they thought they were. The miraculous outcome of the war was Polish independence. Really surprising that it happened. You know, this happened after Pilsudski had this kind of army. There were other paramilitary organizations. In 1917, he saw the impending defeat of the Central Powers. He went to prison. This is another Polish military uniform. But in November 1918, remember, that's the month of the armistice, he was released and sent on a private train to Warsaw. You may know that in 1917, the Germans did that with Lenin. They let him through on a sealed train, hoping he would help foment revolution in Russia. So they were looking for Pilsudski to do some of the same thing. Pilsudski tried to be above partisan politics. Here's an interesting comment from the head of the Polish Socialist Party. Comrades, I took the red tram of socialism to the stop called Independence, and that's where I got off. You may keep on to the final stop if you wish, but from now on, let's address each other as Mr. rather than comrade. As the head of the government, what he wanted was a kind of federation. You have the heart of Poland, the old Polish Congress Kingdom. He wanted the Baltic states. He wanted Belarus. He wanted Ukraine. This was an emulation of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Remember, we saw a map of that as probably the largest country in Europe in the 17th century. Instead, you have a Polish-Ukrainian war of 1918-19, a Polish-Lithuanian war of 1920, in which Vilna is occupied, and the Poles did not leave Vilna for several decades. You have Polish-Czechoslovak border conflicts, an area called Chechen, and a Polish-Soviet war of 1919-1921. So what I'm suggesting here is a really unsettled Central Europe at the end of the First World War. Don't think that just because there was an armistice November 11th, 1918, that things got quiet in the East. As you could see, they did not. Whoops. In Poland, the Poles advanced far into the Ukraine, planning to take over Kiev. The Soviet armies then turned the tables on them and poured into Poland, and it looked like the Soviets were going to take over Warsaw. You have the people of Warsaw getting together, everybody, to defend, and it's what the Poles call the miracle on the Vistula, the river Vistula, where the Russians are defeated and driven back again. So this was the end of Soviet invasion of Poland for the time being, but it was also the end of the dreams of this Polish Commonwealth, a federation, except for the occupation of Vilna and parts of later Lithuania. Pilsudski resigned in 1922, and then in 1926 he takes over the government again. And here's a picture of Pilsudski with soldiers just before the coup in 1926. In France and England, Poles considered him a treasonous ally, and the governments considered him a treasonous ally. In Russia, he was seen as a servant of the Allies. And everybody considered him a failure. Lloyd George in England, Pravda, considered him a military and political failure. And they were all agreed that the end of his career would be the fall of Warsaw. And then we have this miracle on the Vistula where Warsaw did not fall. World War I, this is just to say what was going on in Poland. The usual focus is France and Germany. When you read history books now, that you'd think, oh, that's where it was, this War of the Trenches, and they have this famous Battle of the Marne, where Paris is saved by everybody mobilizing. But in fact, the real bloody battles were in the east, where in 1914 the Russians took over eastern Galicia. Here's a picture of Galicia, Russia over here. What's the Polish areas over here, German areas over here, and this is Galicia. They say Kingdom of Galicia. That's because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a whole bunch of titles. One of his titles was the King of Galicia. He was also called the King of Jerusalem at the time, interestingly enough, among his many titles. But anyway, so the Russians came pouring into this area right here, what I'm circling with the cursor. And this, see where it says BUG? That's the Buk River. Well, that farm that I mentioned a minute ago is right on the edge of the river. So the Russians came pouring in, and the Allies, the Central Powers, went back, and then the Russians came back again. In 1915, the Russians had what was called the Great Retreat. In 1916, they came again, under General Brusilov, and over 2 million people were killed, wounded, or captured in that battle, which is more than all the big battles in the West. My point here is that World War I is not just the French and the Germans and the British, or the Americans after 1917. And here is, just for your information, a map where Belarus is. Here's Poland today, Lithuania today, and Belarus was part of the German occupation. And I show this map because I'm assuming that people are not so familiar with it. During the war, 1.4 million people were expelled from the area. Lots of them were Jews, because the Russian said, okay, anyone who's Jewish is automatically a spy. And they're kicked out from a band along the border. Then in 1916-17, poison gas was used. In 1919, it's the battleground of the Polish-Bolshevik War. Finally, this is before the war, you have the Versailles Peace Conference. This is going on in the West. Here is all these people of Versailles, but we know that it was dominated by Clemenceau of France, by Lord George of England, and input by the Italians, but Woodrow Wilson made a lot of speeches. He had his one of Wilson's points, 14 points for peace. And there's the only one where he singles out a country. And point 13 said, an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant. Notice this line here, free and secure access to the sea. You may know that the government set up something called the Polish Corridor, where Germany was split into two parts in order to have that access to the sea. The Ukraine, on the other hand, didn't get support from anyone. Here's a Ukrainian delegate. When it came to the Wilson Principles, the application of which was predetermined in relation to the people of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy, Lansing, the U.S. Secretary of State, said that he knew only about the single Russian people and that the only way to restore Russia was a federation modeled on the United States. That is, his total ignoring of anything Ukrainian. Although there was a war going on in Ukraine, the Americans chose to ignore that. So you get the formation of this new Polish Republic. Here is the old Congress Kingdom. They take over. Here is White Russia. What's Eastern Galicia, we would call Ukraine. Western Galicia, we will, which is had a lot of Ukrainian and Polish peasants. Little bits here arguing with the Czechs. You don't hear about this much, but the Poles haven't forgotten, because in 1938, when the Germans demanded a part of Czechoslovakia, the Poles said, okay, let's grab back what the Poles took away from us. They also had a bunch of plebiscites. Are you, in this case, are you German or are you Polish? And interestingly enough, the Germans won a lot of those plebiscites here. This is whole area here of Upper Silesia. This is parts of East Prussia, all given to the Germans as a result of those plebiscites, except for here you got the free city of Danzig. And then this Polish corridor. Here is part of, this is part of Poland. Here's Germany, and here's some more Germany. So right here is this, what's called the Polish corridor, to split the German territories. And it may have been justified in some ways, but it was a real problem for the rest of the next 25 years till the Second World War. The Congress Kingdom of Poland, that's this here. There were claims to Galicia, claims to Lithuania and White Russia, including Vilna, claims to Ukraine. We had the plebiscites. And as a result of the plebiscites, you get mixed populations. And you have ethnic conflict for the next long period until the Second World War. Pilsudski wanted a presidential regime, not a parliamentary one, but didn't work. He also had a certain tolerance for ethnic minorities. He was a hero to many Jews. And when he came back to power in 1926, Jews breathed a sigh of relief. After him, however, Poland became increasingly anti-Semitic in its policy, this regime of the colonels in the late 30s. Now, I wanted to mention Roman Dmowski. Roman Dmowski, serious opponent of Pilsudski, is considered the father of Polish nationalism. His movement, called National Democracy, called for a homogeneous Polish-speaking and Roman Catholic nation. It was anti-Semitic, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Lithuanian, and dominant. It became the ideology of an independent Poland and even post-war Poland. And there are still parts of that Dmowski outlook that characterize some Polish trends. To show you, here he is today, even now, Warsaw, a statue of Roman Dmowski. He's the father of the xenophobic policies of the Polish state. And you can see it here. This is in the last few years. It's an ongoing Polish right-wing distrust of foreigners. They're very adamantly anti-immigrant, and it's one of the strengths of the current Polish government, even though the number of immigrants that they took in the last 10 years has been something like 1,000. But it's become a rallying cry for the right wing. And so you see the church as part of it. This is a copy of the Black Madonna. It's not so black, but remember we mentioned that Częstochowa. This is a Polish national image. In the newly independent Poland, there was really a very difficult situation for the Jews. Here you have the Association of Poles of the Jewish Faith. They're trying to say that they want to be part of Poland. The Poles of the Jewish faith, penetrated with a sincere feeling of love for Poland, will, in spite of the difficult conditions of their existence, serve their country as devoted sons and will always be ready to sacrifice their lives and fortunes for its benefit and glory. And this Congress of the Association of Poles of the Jewish Faith condemns with indignation the spreading of hatred among fellow citizens, and especially the pogroms, which are especially incompatible with the spirit of the Polish nation. In this period, large numbers of Jews were killed by various armies. The low estimate is 50,000 killed. The upper limit is 200,000 people. That's a lot of deaths here. One of the Polish armies is commanded by General Józef Haller. Haller was a commander of one of the Polish legions during World War I, and he's a hero to Poles. But his armies are a scourge to the Jews. In the post-war, the pogroms by his troops were part of this large number of deaths that I've just mentioned above. He set up something in 1918 called the Blue Army. There's a picture of the Blue Army. This is defending Warsaw in 1920. That's the Miracle in the Vistula. But he had been active in the Polish-Ukrainian War of 1919. Where there were fights, his army went, and where his army went, there were pogroms. So once again, you have a conflicted image of a Polish hero. Hero to some people, vicious enemy to the other. He opposed the Pilsudski coup of 1926 and went into retirement and left Poland. He became active in the Polish government in exile during World War II. And after World War II, he remained in Britain. What's interesting is in 1993, his remains were transferred to Poland. That is, as we will see, the people in this area don't forget these historical traditions. Haller, 1993, I mean, it's 50 years after the war, but we'll bring them back home. The interwar Polish policies of minorities were really difficult for Ukrainians and Jews. There was Ukrainian separatism, which was marked by a certain terrorism and assassinations on both sides. And the way the Polish army dealt with this was to just destroy whole villages. It was a real brutal pacification. You may be familiar with this from other places that we know in the 20th century. But in this case, you have the Polish army razing villages. Schools are closed. becomes difficult to use Ukraine, and there's no comfort from the Soviet Ukraine, certainly not at the end of the 1920s when collectivization starts. So here's a prison building in a Polish concentration camp in a place called Brzezie Kartuska, which is now in Belarus, and it housed political dissidents and many Ukrainians in this camp. I note here there's an implication for the reception of the Nazi invasion. When the Nazis invaded in 1941, they initially were greeted as liberators by many people in Ukraine. They found out soon enough that that was they weren't great liberators, but this gives you a suggestion of the feeling of the Ukrainians at the time. For Jews during the interwar period, there's economic regression at the same time that there's a demographic explosion. Unfortunately, the outlet for emigration to the United States is cut off by immigration laws, first in 1921 and then 1924. So in Poland, you get a lot of racial discrimination, difficult problems at the universities, in the government employment. And at the same time, amazingly enough, there's a tremendous cultural flowering, especially in the Yiddish-speaking community, with a Yiddish school system. There was a Hebrew school system. There was a lively Yiddish press. In 1925, I think it was, there was a founding of what's called the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which eventually escaped and is in New York now. There were many socially active bodies. So it's an interesting, if sad, picture of a society under attack, but also a society that's very active. Examples of some of the anti-Jewish policies. 1936, they tried to defeat Jewish ritual slaughtering. Universities, they had separate benches where the Jewish students were supposed to sit. They were barred from government jobs. From the Polish side, they denied everything. They said the Jews created their own ghettos, that the pogroms were bogus, that the Jews were not really Poles, that the Jews were profiteers. And they came up with a term called Żydokomuna, meaning Jewish commies. And that Żydokomuna is a charge that lasted till 2021. It's still there. There's still a segment of the right-wing Polish population that talks about the Żydokomuna. And we'll talk about that some more when we look at the post-World War Poland. But the newly independent Poland, again, here is an example of the population problem. It's only a little bit 2/3 Polish, and 1/6 Ukrainian, 10% Jews, and then Belarusians, Germans, and Czechs. So this is something where you have a society like that's influenced by Roman Dmowski and the notion of you have to have a homogeneous Polish state. You have real oppression of some of these minority groups. Here's an attempt to give a picture of Polish society. This is occupational, 2/3 peasantry in I think it's 21, 2/3 peasantry. And in 1931, here you have the population set off by language. So 69% Polish, they say 8.5% Jews, but that's because they're going by language. It was probably 10%. And you have significant numbers of these other people, especially Ukrainians, but also Russians, Lithuanians, Germans, Czechs. What's the relationship between Ukrainians and Jews? We've been talking about Poles and Jews. There are church writings that are anti-Semitic, and you have both the church writings and socioeconomic causes of anti-Semitism. Remember, as far back as Khmelnytsky, remember, he was opposed to the Jewish tax collectors, tax farmers. And ever after, you get this anti-Polish, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic Ukrainian movement. In the 19th century, Ukrainians and Jews had a kind of uneasy coexistence, sometimes easy, sometimes uneasy. And I'm going to give you an example here. Here's a Jewish New Year's card. The Hebrew at the bottom says, repentance, prayer, and good deeds avert the evil decree. That's part of the holiday prayer. But I'm interested here in this melody. It's a Ukrainian melody sung by this group of Hasidim called the Braslaver Hasidim, followers of Nachman of Braslav, who died in 1810. They're called the dead Hasidim because they never appointed a Rebbe. It's the only group. But here's an example of a Ukrainian melody adopted by the Jews. I give you that as an example of a Hasidic melody. First of all, although there were some words there where he was drinking, he said something about drinking brandy and wine, but it's very characteristic of the Hasidim to have just a melody with a ba 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 kind of lack of words as syllables. But that's an interesting combination of Hasidic, Jewish, and Ukrainian traditions. It's interesting that the Braslaver still exist in Russia. There's still groups there. And with the lockdown, because of the virus now, there was a problem because they traditionally gather at his graveside on the anniversary of his death. And you had large numbers of Braslaver Hasidim trying to get around the border guards between Belarus and Ukraine in order to go visit the grave. That's in 2020, so it's still there. The pogromchiks, the people who carried out the pogroms, are often associated with someone named, has a life of his own, Ukrainian nationalist movement with a man named Simon Petlura. I'll give you his name in a minute. The Ruthenian movement was led by the clergy. Then at the end of the First World War, the Germans had this infamous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they tried to, they showed they were not really peaceable. The Germans took over large areas for a short time, and it sort of fed Ukrainian nationalism, anti-German as well as anti-Russian. But during the World War, they had a central council. They declared autonomy, then independence, and then in this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they weren't getting the independence that they had hoped to get because German troops marched in. And you get Ukrainian bands who are defeated by the white armies, meaning anti-Soviets, by the Germans, by the Entente, that is British and French, and by local forces. I mean, it was a really unsettled period. And people in the middle who were not in the army really suffered. So the suffering by the Jews in this case, we have the pogroms in Ukraine earlier in the century, at the time of the 1905 revolt, then again during the war. This is a horrible picture of the 1905 pogrom victims. And we have Simon Petlura, who becomes a leader of bands of peasants and Cossacks. Here is Petlura, I think, here in the, I think this is Petlura here, I'm not sure. But he was the head of the government in 1918. It's interesting that first he aligned with the Poles in the Polish Bolshevik War because it was anti-Bolshevik and they wanted an independent Ukraine. And his most common charge was this Żydo-komuna in Poland and the Jew Bolshevik. The Jews were perceived as the driving force of the Bolsheviks. And there were a number of Jews prominent in the head of the Bolshevik party, you know, Trotsky and Zinoviev, Kamenev, because this was a social outlet for ambitious young Jews too. Petlura was assassinated in 1926 by a man named Shalom Schwarzbard. Shalom Schwarzbard had lost 15 members of his family. And it was an infamous trial in France. Schwarzbard assassinated Petlura, and his defense had to do with these pogroms, and he was acquitted by the French jury. Although the prosecution alleged that he was a Soviet agent. And even today in Ukraine, the historical tradition is he was a Soviet agent. And here, I'm always amazed at the strength of these historical traditions. 2005, this is 75 years or more after the assassination, the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, is laying flowers at the grave of Petlura in Paris. It's just astounding. And here's this tradition, this is Lviv, or Lviv, if you will, in 2008. It's a graffiti. One, Lenin is a kike. This introduced this, and death to Muscovites. So we're getting those two traditions that are still alive there. Not necessarily government policy, but there still is that feeling in some parts. Here is a postcard from 1920. United Ukrainians defend against both Polish and Russian forces. Here's another postcard. Area claimed by Ukraine. So it's way out here in what's now Turkmenistan, Georgia. Here's Galicia over here. You know, everybody wants more land. Just for your orientation, I don't know if you know, this is Crimea. You know, Crimea's been in the news because it was part of Ukraine after 1956, and then the Russians took it back in 2014. We'll talk about that in another lecture, why it was so important to the Russians. But for Ukraine in the 1920s, for a short period, what they called kolonizacja, which is giving Ukrainian character to what's going on. I had a teacher in grad school who talked about it as folklore nationalism. It's okay if you have folk dances and songs, but the central government's in control, or indigenation. But after 1928, when they started collectivizing agriculture, that was it, even for the folklore nationalism. And we'll talk more about Ukraine next time. The terrible things happened in the 1930s. But just as a summary to end this presentation, Poland in the 1920s and 30s, you have a fractious democracy in the early 20s. The coup by Pilsudski in 1926, rule of the colonels after he died in the late mid-30s. In the Ukraine, we have folklore nationalism, collectivization, Holodomor, meaning famine, and we will talk a bit about that, a lot about that next time. And then the Soviet purges. For the Jews, who are populous in both areas, there's a cultural flowering amidst political and economic repression in Poland. Whereas in Ukraine, you have upward mobility for dedicated Jewish communists. And that is somehow, I got just to 12 o'clock. I didn't leave time for questions, but I can.
Larry, I have a question
Go ahead.
about Danzig, which was in the Polish corridor. Was that originally German or Polish, or what was it?
Independent.
Danzig.
It was a German-speaking city. That was the justification for giving it to Germany. It goes back to the old Hanseatic League from the medieval period, and it was like a lot of cities, German cities surrounded by Polish peasantry.
So that's why Hitler was so anxious to take it back. In other words,
Yeah, I mean it was, but all through the 1920s and 30s, this was part of German nationalist propaganda. That area belongs to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can understand that. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Don?
I went to a Bastille parade with my wife, and the very first group that went down the Champs-Élysées were hussars.
Polish hussars?
Yeah, I guess so.
Were they winged?
And the other question I have is this: you didn't mention Paderewski.
Paderewski was a pianist turned nationalist politician. Was elected the first president of an independent Poland, but he didn't leave a lasting memory. And unfortunately, we can't get him for any of our Monday night concerts here.
He's kind of dead.
It was